You know, it's really great that Mike would ask me to come speak before you. I appreciate the kind invitation. But I understand you really have a full day planned, a really exciting day. My goodness, you're going to hear a few words from me. I don't know how exciting that is. But the tour that you're going to have here at the History Center will be richly rewarding. Let me tell you, there's a lot of history that you will be exposed to. And I understand that there's a special luncheon that you will go to at the August Wilson Center, and it'll be prepared by, I believe it's Patrick Polk, and he's going to really whip up quite some cuisine and satiate your palate. Listen, I'll begin my talk, and hopefully afterwards there will be time to answer any questions the audience you just might have. And again, thank you for this opportunity. When I talk about the Courier, I am reminded of one man's vision put into motion. In 1910, a young lawyer turned editor, Robert L. Vann, saw a need to tell a story of African Americans' history, their trials, tribulations, and accomplishments. Vann answered the call of John B. Russwurm, who declared in the first black newspaper published in 1827 editorial, quote, "For too long, others have spoken for us. Today, we plead our own cause," unquote. In an era of overt segregation and denial of opportunity to African Americans, Vann assembled a staff of writers and photographers to tell this unique story in the written word and captured in photos that illuminated those words. Oftentimes, those stories and photos were sent back to the Courier under very difficult circumstances, where there were many who did not want those stories to be told. But it happened, and the Courier was there. Much of what I tell you today was exclusive to a people who otherwise could not see themselves in any positive light in other media. Their stories were celebrated in the pages of the Courier. They lifted the community and inspired them to new heights and allowed many to see a world of black accomplishment they never would have seen otherwise. But they believed because it happened, and the Courier was there. Now, I know the role the Courier played in my life, but consider the impact it had on a young girl in the rural backwoods of North Carolina, whose life's exposure was the endless fields around her home. As she tells her story, she recalls seeing her first Pittsburgh Courier as delivered by the ministers who got them from the Pullman porters for distribution in, quote, colored communities. And all at once, a new world opened up to her. She saw black people doing all kinds of things, you know, in sports, in government, and politics, and entertainment. Mostly, she saw black people realizing their dream. She was inspired to reach for her dream. She eventually left the South and headed to Chicago, where she started her own advertising agency, the very first female-headed African-American-owned agency of its kind, the Proctor Gardner Advertising Agency. Her name, Barbara Proctor. She credits her success to the stories and images she saw in the Courier. She knew what she saw in the Courier was real, because it happened, and the Courier was there. You here today have an opportunity to discover some of the things that Barbara Proctor saw as a young girl in North Carolina that helped to change her life and give her hope for the future. In 1907, aspiring black writer Edward Horston, a security guard at the H.J. Heinz plant, began publishing a sheet of his writings, which he called the Pittsburgh Courier. 3 years later, 101 years ago, Hill District Attorney and businessman Robert L. Vann took control of the venture as editor and publisher and formally chartered the paper that became one of the most transformative publications in history. Not only did it report the news of African Americans' travails, successes locally, nationally, and globally, but in doing so, it also made news. By World War II, the Courier had a circulation of more than 250,000, had offices in 14 cities, and published Eastern, Midwest, and West Coast editions. Vann was determined to have the Courier become a vehicle for black political empowerment, social and economic and cultural improvement. Though Vann, who died in 1940, did not live to see his dream come to fruition, the campaigns against lynching, the World War II era Double V campaign, his campaigns for better education and employment helped shatter the shackles of segregation and set the stage for the civil rights movement. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, when local musicians like Earl Father Hines, Billy Strayhorn, and Billy Eckstein became international sensations, the Courier was there. When local artists like Romar Bearden joined other stars of the Harlem Renaissance, such as poet Langston Hughes, the Courier was there also. The Courier was there to report on the dire conditions of many African Americans during the Great Depression, which saw black unemployment at more than 40%, and food hunger marches through the city. But instead of just merely reporting the strike, the Courier editors and staff were there along with the Urban League, passing out baskets of food to those in need. But more than just reporting on the artists, with reporters like Evelyn Cunningham in its New York office, the Courier gave its readers an insight into the burgeoning black middle class doctors, lawyers, and businessmen who were patrons of art explosion. In the 20s and 30s also saw the emergence of some of the Courier's premier sports writers who benefited from the city's two dominant teams of the Negro baseball leagues, the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays. And the Courier was there when African-American athletes like Pittsburgher John Woodruff joined Jesse Owens in the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games and defeated Hitler's master race. In 1932, after years of pleas to U.S. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover to do something about segregation and the treatment of African Americans, Vann decided to use the Courier's influence to force the issue. So, in a speech to the St. James Literary Society in Cleveland, Ohio, Vann told his audience at that time to turn Lincoln's picture to the wall and join him in voting for Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. Nationally, more than 1 million responded, 45,000 in Allegheny County alone, and helped to sweep in the New Deal in a landslide. The 30s also saw Vann teaming up with A. Philip Randolph, head of the Pullman Porters Union, to ensure blacks in the segregationist South could receive the Courier after the U.S. Postal Service and the FBI disallowed mailing the paper to the South. But getting those papers delivered down south was indeed a challenge. So using traditional shipping methods, the newspapers were burned, dumped, or destroyed. by those who saw the Courier as a threat to the Southern way of life. The Courier fought for equality and waged anti-lynching campaigns that rallied the people to mobilize and join the fight. But not to be outdone, an arrangement was made with A. Philip Randolph, head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, to have his porters take papers to a variety of Southern towns where the black ministers would then come, take them, and distribute them to their congregations. With their help, the Courier amassed a circulation of 450,000, the largest of any nationally distributed black newspaper. Now, the Courier's international coverage also blossomed in the 30s with coverage of the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia, and it was covered by correspondent George Schuyler. The outbreak of World War II saw even more international coverage, and also the advent of the Double V campaign, which stood for victory against fascist oppression and victory at home against discrimination. Courier reporters like Frank Bolden reported from overseas on African Americans at war and secured the landmark interviews with Joseph Stalin and Mahatma Gandhi, who refused to speak to the white press. Others reported on stories of discrimination in the military here at home, like the case of Dory Miller, a cook aboard the USS West Virginia when it was attacked at Pearl Harbor. Miller shot down 6 planes and became the first African American to receive the Navy Cross. The Courier lobbied for him to return home to promote war bonds like other heroes. The Navy said no. Miller was killed at the Battle of Tarara in 1943. After the war, as she had since her husband's death, Jessie Vann, with the assistance of editors Ira Lewis, Bill Nunn Sr., and P.L. Prattis, continued to build on the Courier's reach. And in them, let's see, the issues throughout the 1950s were the stories of African Americans making grudging progress against discrimination. President Truman integrating the armed forces in 1948, Jackie Robinson breaking baseball's color barrier in 1947, and the continued battle against lynching, and separate but equal education, spearheaded by a young attorney named Thurgood Marshall. Courier photojournalist Alex Rivera covered several of these landmark stories. What a man, he just died a couple of years ago at age 92, I believe. 60s and 70s saw the rise of the civil rights movement and the subsequent decline of the Courier. As southern cities started their own black publications and white media realized it needed black reporters to go into African American neighborhoods, especially after the riots following the death of Martin Luther King, both reporters and readers moved away. In 1960, S.B. Fuller, a very successful black businessman from Chicago, quite a man, very, very successful. He had products that he sold nationally. You probably heard of Fuller products over the years. That was S.B. Fuller. He also owned a department store in Chicago. Very astute, successful businessman. He became a major shareholder in the Pittsburgh Courier Publishing Company. Later, he became chairman of the board and owner of the Pittsburgh Courier. Now, Fuller changed the Courier's image from that of a, quote, Negro protest organ, unquote, to one that reflected the total community concept in all of its primary circulation. In other words, he tried to become like the downtown newspapers. Needless to say, that venture failed before, because he had moved away from the primary mission of the black press, which is to plead our own cause. Pittsburgh Courier went bankrupt in 1966, but was quickly resurrected by John H. Sengstack, owner of the Chicago Daily Defender. He moved the paper, now called the New Pittsburgh Courier, to the city's south side. Hazel Garland, what a lady, an employee since 1944, said, "When we came to work and the doors were padlocked, it was one of the worst feelings I had ever had. This was our life, gone. No one knew it was coming. So you can imagine how glad we were when we received the phone call that Mr. Sengstack had purchased the paper, and we would all be back to work again. We hated to leave Center Avenue, but it would have cost too much to get the building back on Center." Close quote. Sengstack said there was, incredibly, no way that he could idly stand by and allow one of the greatest newspapers in our history to go under. "We need the black press more today than ever," he said. "To let the Courier fail would be sending the wrong message to people all over the world, both black and white. The Courier, along with the Defender, are the symbols of freedom. They, more than any other paper, have led the fight for Negro freedom in this country, and we still have a long ways to go. So no, I could not and will not allow this great paper to go under. There is so much more to do in this country when it comes to the Negro." Close quote, Sengstack said in a conversation in the late 70s. After his reorganization, behind him were a new group of leaders: Carl Morris, James Lewis, Hazel Garland, Woody Taylor, myself, and others. And the New Pittsburgh Courier was there for the integration of the city's police force and the rise of Caleb Irvis to the speakership of the Pennsylvania State House. And the Courier was there for Nate Smith's protests against U.S. Steel and the integration of the building trade unions. The Courier was there to make sure blacks were a part of the ownership and employees of the first cable company to come to Pittsburgh. That was Warner Cable. Remember that name. The Courier was also there to see its former editor, Bill Nunn Jr., lauded by the Pittsburgh Steelers for finding talents at black colleges like Joe Green, Joe Gillow, John Stallworth, Frank Lewis, Elsie Greenwood, Mel Blunt, and many others, where no white scouts bothered to listen, to look. The 1980s saw the end of the steel industry in Pittsburgh and the loss of thousands of jobs for African Americans throughout the Ohio Valley here. It also saw the city lose its position as one of the nation's top corporate headquarters cities. I think we were number three back there, which led to more job loss and advertising dollars for the paper. Now, while the city reinvented itself as an educational and medical industry center in the 90s and 2000s, many black neighborhoods and communities not recovered. The Courier has documented also the continued political inroads made by people like Chris Smith, Salah Odin, Jim Bowles, Bill Robinson, Dwayne Darkins, the late Dwayne Darkins, Valerie McDonald Roberts, and the late attorney Berg Brown, who nearly became Pittsburgh's first black mayor. The crusade for the 21st century, one we wage right now, is the fight to stop the black-on-black violence and drugs in our neighborhoods that are devastating our cities throughout the country. And also the need for quality education for all African Americans. John Sengstad died in 1997. After his death, Real Times Inc. purchased the Courier along with his other 3 papers, the Chicago Daily Defender, the Michigan Chronicle, and the Tri-State Defender in Memphis, Tennessee in January 2003. And modestly, under my direction as editor and publisher, the Courier was there in 2008 when Illinois Senator Barack Obama became the first African-American president of the United States. And in the second decade of the 21st century, if it's happening in the black community, the new Pittsburgh Courier is there. There are many celebrated stories in the Courier over the decades that fought against segregation, fought for better housing, fought for equal employment, and for the equal rights of African Americans to live as fully vested Americans. But perhaps the success of Robert L. Vann and his publishing legacy is best captured in how well others have replicated his success by creating vehicles of communication to black communities throughout the nation. More than 400 black newspapers have emerged since the Vann era, giving new voice to those who are not heard, new champions for forgotten causes, and a positive view of those many African Americans, many Americans chose not to know. Just briefly, I'd like to talk to you about some of the major campaigns Courier waged that changed the world. There was great pressure exerted on the government with letters written to President Calvin Coolidge to pass anti-lynching legislation, an ongoing campaign. Outrage was also expressed by the Courier surrounding the injustice of the Scottsboro trial, also, and the lynchings in Natchez, Mississippi, and elsewhere. Well, actually, no law was ever passed against lynching, but it was a campaign that was conducted arduously, tenaciously, and ongoing. Of course, I've already mentioned that Courier publisher Robert L. Vann's massive political campaign in 1932 and his historic speech appealing to 12 million blacks to turn the picture of Lincoln to the wall resulted in an abrupt change in political parties for the mass of African Americans to change their political affiliation from Republican to Democrat. Thus, 70 years of Republican Party patronage established during the Reconstruction era was suddenly reversed. The Italian-Ethiopian war coverage campaign was covered by war correspondent J.A. Rogers. The Italian war tragedy, Ethiopian war tragedy, was covered exclusively by the Pittsburgh Courier at the request of ruler Haile Selassie. The Courier coverage resulted in the eventual support by the United States to the Ethiopians against the fascist government of Italy in the 1940s. We mentioned the Dory Miller campaign during the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Air Force of the Japanese Empire. Dory Miller, who hailed from Waco, Texas, was a cook, working in the mess hall while his ship was under fire. Shot down several Japanese planes. Miller was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery, but the Courier skillfully showed the public every aspect of Miller's heroic actions to the world, which resulted in the Navy honoring him. The Miller campaign was a vital part of the fight for all African Americans in the armed forces. The Double V campaign during World War II that mandated victory at home, victory abroad, was created by the illustrators at the Courier. They designed the double V symbol and to reflect the sentiments of black soldiers fighting against fascism, Nazism, and oppression abroad while their families faced racism, discrimination, and oppression on American soil. The entire community of African Americans soon supported the Double V movement by openly displaying victory signs and often expressed in clothing and hairstyles that were never seen before since the public conduct campaign was directed at ending segregation in the nation's capitals. There were protests organized and supported by the NAACP and the Urban League. Pickets were directed to end discrimination against the Yellow Cab Company, bus transportation system, and public accommodations that included restaurants and hotels. Sports campaigns were a major part of the Courier campaigns in the 40s through the 70s. Courier sports writers and legends, Bill Nunn Sr., Chester Washington, Wendell Smith, Bill Nunn Jr., and others applied extreme pressure on Major League Baseball, the National Football League, and professional basketball and boxing to open the doors of universities and professional sports to blacks. Now the Courier picked all-American football teams from black colleges, as well as the East-West game of the Negro baseball leagues. The story of Bill Nunn Jr., champion or making that first dynasty a reality, Pittsburgh Steelers, came from black colleges. These were all guys nobody even thought searching out. Quite an accomplishment. There are other campaigns that were waged, Tuskegee Airmen, and fight to get our guys flying planes. You know, there were two notable campaigns that resulted in the support of a family called Nixon from the Courier, with a check to the wife of a lynching victim, Mrs. Nixon, personally by Mrs. Jessie Vann. Another campaign came as a result of a young Ohio girl who required an oxygen tank every day of her life, which cost $8.49. So they rallied Courier people to lend their money and support that cause. The murder of 15-year-old Emmett Till from Chicago, Illinois, and Greenville, Mississippi, were allegedly whistling at a white woman inside a country store, shocked the entire country. As a result of the Courier coverage of the slain youth, all Americans became outraged after the two men who murdered Till were set free. In 1957, free elections in Ghana, Africa, appeared as part of a new worldwide movement to escape British and French colonial rule. The movement took shape during the same time as the new civil rights movement began to enjoy the support of freedom riders in the South. The Courier allowed our community to see, for the first time since the African slave trade, themselves as part of Africa, as they sought the same kind of freedom from oppression they were experiencing. In conclusion, there were many campaigns waged by the Courier that essentially lifted a nation's conscience that ultimately led toward a more inclusive society. Thank you. I'd love to take questions.
We have some time to ask questions.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the new Courier is going about the current campaign to reduce violence?
Oh, yes. Yes. She's asking about what the Courier is doing to deal with the current state of violence going on. Several years ago, we became very concerned that some of the leadership in our community allowed for excuses about what was going on in the community. And we sat down and we said, these are young black men killing other black men. This is a community problem. We have to address it. And we have to allow our community to see how it is devastating, destroying our community, both socially, economically, businesses can't locate there, otherwise. So we developed a campaign called Under Attack by Us. Made it very clear that this is a community problem. What we did was to monthly list all the deaths that occurred and highlight how many deaths and how many black lives were being taken each month. Quite honestly, there was great resentment initially in the community. But as the campaign continued, more and more people became incensed, became outraged over what they saw was a real community problem. And we then saw more people coalescing around the issue, holding vigils, rallies. Ministers came to the fore to challenge people in the community. We saw new leaders emerging from within the community, working directly with young people to turn them away from either drugs, crime, or what have you. So it has made a difference. In contrast, while we don't have the same population that Philadelphia has, I think there are about 50 murders at this particular time. There are over 300 in Philadelphia. No one has taken on the challenge to turn things around in Philly at this point. We are having a lot of success here, but it is a campaign that we conduct every month. Yes?
Mr. Dutz, we were reminded recently of the Freedom Riders you mentioned by the fine documentary that was shown on PBS. And we learned again how there was controversy whether these very brave kids were helping or hurting the civil rights movement. And we know the Kennedy administration was dragging its feet. What was the editorial position of the Courier at that time?
At that time, we supported all efforts that moved towards gaining our freedom, and ending discrimination. Because in the community, there were a variety of different philosophies as to how you would achieve a specific end. So young people, they had more energy. They were up for the fight. They were up to withstand whatever. They didn't want to be somewhat like their parents who sheepishly went along with the injustices heaped upon them. They stood their ground and fought back. So it was all welcome. It's akin to what was going on, the rhetoric that Martin Luther King espoused, that Malcolm X espoused, that Stokely Carmichael espoused. All of it was valid from different perspectives, and it persuaded people to get involved with changing the system. Yes? Yes? Yes?
Yes, I was wondering in your wonderful presentation that why T.D. Harris's name had the surface.
Ah, you want me to talk about Teenie. Teenie Harris, Charles Teenie Harris, had a distinguished, very, very distinguished career with the Courier. I was privileged to know and work with Teenie Harris. He had also his own studio on Center Avenue, where he took photos of families and people and otherwise. But working at the Courier, he was the principal Pittsburgh photographer for decades. There were quite a few other photographers working at the Courier who don't get the same acknowledgement as Teenie. The reason Teenie gets so much consideration is Teenie took his photos, he developed them at his home, and in his basement he had all of his negatives there. He filed them away. He was very thorough in this. Now, one point, I lived around the corner from Teenie. He lived on Mulford Street. I lived on Kelly. And there were occasions when he took photos, he would print them, and I would go by his house and pick up the photos and bring them into the office for publication. So I got a chance to see his setup downstairs and how he printed everything and how he filed away everything. But the real story about Teenie is when people began to celebrate him, when they began to lift him up as this phenomenal photographer, which he was, Teenie would say privately, I don't know why they're heaping all this on me. You know, I don't think I really deserve all this acclaim. He said, you know, I just love to take pictures. It was just that simple. He truly loved to take pictures. If you ever saw one-shot Teenie Harris go into a room, survey the room, find his spot, and identify immediately what it was he was going to shoot. It was one shot. He earned that title. Didn't want to waste any bulbs. But he got outstanding, superior photos that have lasting value. And many of them are on display now at the Canadian Museum. Quite a man. Yes, sir.
The TV documentary, and you mentioned the role of the Pullman porters in distributing the paper. I never knew that the Postal Service had a restriction on carrying it. Could you say more about that, about how formal the distribution system was, and what kind of interference the Pullman porters met with distributing the paper?
Okay, he wants to know about the Pullman porters situation, and he didn't know that there was a restriction by the post office, and certainly J. Edgar Hoover at one time. Part of that goes to the fact that the coverage that the Courier gave to our our brothers in the armed forces. We showed and wrote stories about the segregated patterns that existed in the military. We also told stories and filed them and sent them back about the injustices in southern towns against our boys in uniform. We also talked in terms of our boys' willingness to want to fly, Tuskegee Airmen, wanting to fight, and what have you. But some of those stories were deemed seditious. Incredibly as it sounds, they were deemed seditious by the paper because we were rabble-rousing or exposing injustices heaped upon people of color in the uniform, and they don't want those stories to be told. So as a consequence, Hoover, who was very powerful in those days, was aligned with those who he could just simply say to the postmaster, let's not have these papers going down south. So it was an organized campaign to keep the papers going into the South, and actually in other areas as well, because they did not want to really change the way things were in the South. It was one thing to tell a story about what's happening in the military, but for others to recognize that their boys in uniform were being treated like that. There were young men in uniform who were lynched and their bodies burned. Those are the kind of stories we would tell. They didn't want those stories to be told. It was called seditious, incredibly as it sounds. So, again, they did work with Philip Randolph to figure out a way to get the papers on the trains to the Pullman porters and then dropped off in key areas and distributed. So that's essentially how that happened. Yes, sir?
What was the relationship between the Courier and the white papers in Pittsburgh?
My understanding is it was very good. I've seen, I know that the Courier execs were involved with the newspaper guild here locally. They attended the same banquets and what have you. There was great linkage with the Post-Gazette, the Block family. I think it's during the time, there's a story that goes during the time the SB4 was trying to transform the Courier, that I think it was Regis that was working at the Post-Gazette, and he supplied stories for the Courier and what have you. Interestingly, Myron Cope worked at the Courier. You know that? Didn't know that one. Yeah. Quite a few people have come through the portals of the Courier. The Courier itself practiced what it preached. It believed in equal opportunity. And throughout its history, there have always been whites that were involved in working with the Courier. So it has not been exclusively black domain, contrary to some.
There was a question back there, the lady.
Go right ahead.
I may have missed this, but how many other African-American papers are there in this country?
There are presently about 200. At one time, there were well over 400.
You choose.
All right, we like it so much.
So I'm wondering how to buy the paper. I pick it up in the Giant Eagle every once in a while. What is your delivery distribution system now, and how would you buy the Courier?
Well, you're right. Giant Eagle, it's available in all Giant Eagle stores. great working relationships down in Walgreens. Let's see, we have, we work through a distribution center that drops off papers or supplies papers to a lot of the newspaper outlets downtown and out in the surrounding areas. So, but the easiest way is a subscription. Let the mailman bring it to you. And it works. It works. Scotty knows.
Is it a weekly?
Yes, it is. We come out Wednesday of each week. Yes, sir.
What relationship were there between the Courier and Urban League in the promotion of action?
Anybody get the question?
What was the relationship between the Urban League and I'll add the NAACP and working with the Courier? A very good working relationship. A lot of times the issues of concern were basically the same. There's a story that is suggested that probably amplifies the thought of the relationship specifically with the NAACP. It goes like this. It just simply says that on the issues, the NAACP were the bullets, the Courier was the gun. We told the story that fired the bullets for the NAACP to get their story out there and lift up the issues and expose their point of view. So it's very congenial working relationship and very thorough, consistent. Yes, sir. Another.
Many of the newspapers in the United States got together to improve their ability to gather news by forming the Associated Press and the United Press. Was the Courier ever a member of these organizations?
No. The question is, many newspapers formed formed associations and across this country. Was the Courier ever affiliated with them? Not the ones that you mentioned, Associated Press and the others. John Sengstad, what a man. What a man, let me tell you. When he took over the Defender, he turned it into the Chicago Daily Defender, one of 2 black dailies in the country. But he also had the wisdom and the vision to know that that's what we needed to do, to come together under one umbrella or an organization. He formed then what was called the National Newspaper Publishers Association. And he brought all the black newspapers together under this umbrella, this organization. It's still in existence today. He also created an advertising arm called Amalgamated Publishers, Inc., or APIs, as it's more specifically known. And they sold advertising for all black newspapers across the country. So, yes, from the standpoint of them having their own network, they formed their own network to that extent.
How's the question?
The very last question. All right.
It's a comment.
It's a comment.
Back in the 1950s, there was a strike for all the white papers in Pittsburgh. And my dad had to have this paper, and that was my introduction to the Pittsburgh Courier.
That's a good point to finish on. I'd like us to thank the speaker again for very